In the first part of this series on policy implications of growth theory, I've provided an overview of the different areas in which policymakers can try to increase economic growth and well-being. And I've also clarified some aspects of the terminology. Now in this part 2, I want to discuss 3 areas: investment, efficiency, and education, where economic policy can actually influence economic growth in the medium run, not yet so much in the long run, except for education policies, as we will see. Now, this first area on investment or promoting capital accumulation derives directly from the insights of the Solow model that we had. In the Solow model, recall that capital accumulation was able to raise economic growth in the medium run, but it was not able to raise economic growth in the long run. So capital accumulation, or something that increases investment, can raise economic growth over a few years up to decades, but not in the very long run. Now, what can be done to foster physical capital accumulation? One of the standard policies is to introduce or increase investment tax credits. So these are tax deductions that businesses get if they invest. So for their investment, they can deduct the investment costs from their tax liabilities and pay fewer taxes. And that should provide an incentive to invest more and therefore to promote physical capital accumulation. A similar effect can be achieved by subsidies on certain types of investment. Particularly, one would target those investments that create positive externalities or reduce negative externalities. For example, investments that reduce pollution, such as investments in cleaner production or in filter technologies, and so on and so forth. Then the third aspect is related to investments of the public. So a huge part of physical capital is actually public infrastructure. So if the public invests in infrastructure such as building railways, power plants, improve the power grid, build seaports, airports, fiber optic connections, and so on and so forth, then this is physical capital accumulation on the one hand, but it also increases the productivity of private investment by businesses. So for example, if you have a firm that produces according to the machines that it has invested in, but then there are no roads and no boards with which the firm could bring what they produce to the markets, then it would be useless for the firm to invest in the first place. So public investment and private investment are complementary to some degree. And sometimes it's the case that the public does not really have the money to invest in certain projects or something else. Then sometimes they get into public-private partnerships, actually, where, for example, businesses bring or put the money on the table with which investments are done, or parts of the money, and later on they are granted a certain share of income that is generated by their investment. For example, with respect to highways, then they would get a certain fraction of the tolls that are paid for driving on these highways. So all of these policies can increase investment and therefore physical capital accumulation. And in the Solow model, we have seen that this can increase economic growth during the phase when the economy converges to the steady state. Then we have also discussed economic models into which we have introduced human capital accumulation or education. The straightforward extension of the Solow model towards the Menke-Romer-Weil model was exactly such a case, where another production factor is introduced into the Solow model, namely human capital. And what we've seen there is that an increase in human capital can also lead to an increase in productivity and therefore in per capita GDP. So human capital accumulation can also foster economic growth in the medium run. When we extended the research and development-based growth model of Roma with endogenous technological change by human capital, we have seen that there is even a channel by which human capital accumulation can increase long-run economic growth. So therefore, of course, promoting education is a very powerful economic policy to foster economic growth in the medium run, but also in the long run. Now, here we ask what we can do to promote education. The two most important aspects here, in my opinion, are to have up-to-date curricula and that school children have access to high quality study material that is actually aligned with the results of modern science. This may seem completely self-evident, but nevertheless, in many countries, IT skills are not taught at school, or at least not properly, and school children, when they leave school, have problems in reading, writing, and doing math. And this is unacceptable actually in a modern economy. I mean, it's unacceptable from a personal perspective, but it's also unacceptable from an economic perspective actually, because this is a huge waste of resources. At the same time, a lot of resources, particularly the time of children and the time of teachers, is invested in teaching children stuff like knitting, sewing, and dead languages and so on. I mean, this may be interesting to some and even important to some, but often it's the case that it's compulsory for everybody and it's done for years, such that really huge resources went into this. In addition, school material often includes errors and outdated knowledge, actually. And solving these two issues, that curricula are up to date and really targeted to the needs of a modern society, and that the study material is of a high quality, can go a long way into ensuring a decent education for all children. Another important point is to enable lifelong learning and to provide those people whose skills become obsolete later on due to automation, digitalization, or technological progress in general, with the skills that they need to succeed on the labor market and to find new jobs. And here I think it's particularly important in school to not put emphasis on stuff like learning something by heart, but to apply the knowledge in different circumstances actually than in the circumstances that they are first taught. So really teach critical thinking and teach the basics of reading, writing, and math, but not repeating stuff by heart. Then what research has shown is that it's of utmost importance to have highly qualified and professional teachers. This means, of course, that you have to train, treat, and pay them well. And the best students should actually have an incentive to become teachers and not something else. So it should really be a job with a high prestige and also a high payment, because they are the ones who train the next generation and who have really an important responsibility. In this context, research has also found out that it is less important to have small class sizes. And now, of course, if you force class sizes to be small, and you have a certain distribution of abilities over teachers, that means that actually you force class sizes to be small at the expense of having good teachers, because a good teacher can only teach so many hours, right? And therefore, forcing classes to be small can actually be a counterproductive policy. So it's better to have, in case of doubt, larger classes, but well-trained professional teachers who know how to transmit human capital to the next generation. Then, of course, it's important to reduce bureaucratic obstacles for teachers. In many countries, they spend more and more time on filling out questionnaires, being involved in organizational issues, documentation stuff, and so on and so forth. And this is not directly related to the job that they should do and to their primary task, which is to improve the skills of the children that they are entrusted with. And therefore, it's really important to free them from these bureaucratic obligations. Finally, I think it's really surprising and also counterproductive that we still have schedules at school during the day and over the whole year that originate in agricultural societies from 200 years ago when school was made compulsory. So, for example, the long summer breaks during which school children were supposed to help at home with the harvest, or that school ends at noon because one parent is anyway at home and spends time with the cows. And nowadays, this is just not the case anymore, but families have problems actually to kind of cover the whole summer break because there is not so much vacation, or to have a parent at home because in most cases both of them are working. And doing away with these schedules could also help in terms of studying at school, where studying could be spread over more weeks, but also in terms of improving gender equality and improving labor force participation. To promote efficiency, three areas are of particular importance. First of all, cracking down on corruption. Corruption is one of the most damaging aspects in the modern economy that reduces efficiency. And it's also important to cut back possibilities for rent seeking and lobbying activities, which both are damaging on the one hand and they cost enormous amounts of resources on the other. So, if one can make strides against corruption, rent seeking, and lobbying activities, this can increase efficiency quite a lot. Another aspect is the flexibility of the labor market. If labor markets are not flexible, then research has shown that it's very difficult actually to get firms to grow. So, for example, if you have requirements that a firm above a certain size needs to provide additional benefits for workers, or it becomes more difficult to fire them, then there is often a clustering of firms below this size and they don't grow larger. Labor market reforms have also been shown in the past to boost per capita GDP quite a lot if they led to an increase in employment as such. But of course, flexibility of the labor market is sometimes a misused word because it's not going only in one direction. It also needs to be bolstered up with security for workers, so that, for example, also workers have an easier time to search for a new job as at another firm if they think that their current job is not good enough for them, or thus that they are not able to apply their skills in an adequate manner. So raising this efficiency would require more flex security, so flexibility and security on labor markets. Then we have active labor market policies, and some of them I've already mentioned. It's important to have retraining programs for those people whose skills become obsolete, because that is also a huge source of inefficiency if you are not able to retrain workers who get fired because of structural issues. Other aspects in this domain could also include wage subsidies for low skilled workers and even public employment programs, where these employment programs have also been evaluated from an economic perspective, and that it's often much better policy to kind of fund workers publicly than to allow them to be unemployed for long periods of time. And such active labor market policies can also go a long way in reducing inefficiency. And finally, again, my favorite one, which I think is important in all domains, that's reducing bureaucratic requirements. Almost all workers actually complain about bureaucracy, and it's really sometimes stifling to creativity, to productivity, to have to conform with all these bureaucratic requirements and filling out forms and whatnot. And whatever can be done to reduce that can bolster efficiency quite a lot. Now, this finishes an overview of potential policies, or some potential policies that can go quite a long way in increasing economic growth through physical capital accumulation, through promoting efficiency, and through promoting human capital accumulation. In part 3, we will then look at policies that can help to foster innovation.